All right. How is everyone doing? I'm going to hide that for a sec. Tweet to the world that we are live, and we'll get started in just a few minutes here. Just getting all my ducks in a row. Making sure that everything is working. All my ducks in a row. Okay. Cool. Cool. Making sure that everything. All right. So, I'm going to do some Turbo Native live coding today. If you can't hear me, it looks off, throw something in the chat, and I can see it over on my other monitor here. But yeah, we're going to work on some Turbo Native stuff. We're going to do an iOS app. We're going to do an Android app. Hopefully we'll get some Strata in there as well. We'll wrap up with the Q&A if there's still more time. But as this progresses, feel free to just drop questions in the chat, and I will get to them when I can. I probably figure this will go on for about an hour. If not, maybe a little bit longer. We'll see until I get hungry and break for lunch. But yeah, we're just going to get started in just a few minutes here. I'm going to just make sure that everything is still working on the stream here. So let's just pop open the YouTube. Make sure that everything is still working on the stream here. We got 25 people already. So awesome. Let's just pop open the YouTube. Make sure that everything. Okay, so let's do it. 3 after. We're starting. Let's go. So agenda. New Xcode project, we're going to create an iOS app. New Android Studio project, we're going to create an Android app. We're going to add Strata to each. We're going to build a little component, and then we're going to do some Q&A. For those who are new to my content, know who I am. I am Joe Mazzolati, the Turbo Native guy. If you haven't heard of me, I blog on mazzolati.com. I talk about Turbo Native every week. I send out a newsletter. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, you can subscribe right here. There's also some exclusive stuff that I send out to that newsletter every couple of weeks, like sneak peeks on the book that I'm writing on Turbo Native for Rails developers, and also some stuff that I don't want to say too spicy for the web, but things that I like to keep between a small community and not published to everyone at large. For example, just last week I wrote a recap of like what Apple's doing with their change to in-app purchases and my thoughts on that and what it means for Turbo Native developers. So definitely give that a look if you're interested. And yeah, mazzolati.com/newsletter. Alrighty, so let's dive in. We are going to first work with the Daily Log app. This is an open source app. You can check it out. It's dailylog.ing. It will show up like this. If you're not signed in already, a little app that's built with Turbo Native and Rails in the App Store you can download to kind of keep track of, well, what matters. Keep track of your daily exercise, your medication, all that stuff, your water intake, your food. If you are driving, please do not watch this video. Watch the recap, Jonathan Spooner. But for real, obviously the recap will be available for replay later if you want to get a deeper dive into that and you don't want to slow down and stuff. But definitely let me know if I'm going too fast. So Daily Log here, you can also, right up here, fork me on GitHub. This is open source. There's the iOS app. There's the Rails app. All the code is right here. The Android app, though, is empty. We're going to work on some of that today, I think. But why I start with this is because it gives us a head start on a Rails server that's already up and working. We don't have to worry about building a Rails server or anything like that. So, like I said, you can track your exercise. I've already taken my multivitamin today. I had some avocado toast for breakfast. I also just drank, I think I had like 12 ounces of water. So we'll add that in there. And we get a little nice flash message and all that good stuff. So iOS, let's create an iOS app, right? On open Xcode, we get dropped into this little welcome screen. We're going to create a new project. And we're going to get presented with a bunch of options. We are going to create an iOS app. So we can select those options for iOS app and hit next. I'm going to call this daily log because that is what we're building here. If I were going to publish this into the App Store, I would select one of the teams from that dropdown. I'm not going to go that far in this tutorial, so we're just going to keep it as none. And then I always like to do reverse domain notation here, which is like Maslati.com, builds it, so com.maslati. Always make sure you have a storyboard, not Swift UI. You can add Swift UI, but to build the core of the app, I always like to use a storyboard. Swift, we don't want to use Objective-C on this, and we don't need any local storage or tests for today. Click next. I'm going to just toss this on the desktop. I already have an iOS app for the daily log. This is going to be kind of like more of an example. So this is going to just go on my desktop here, and I'm going to hit create. You do need to use Xcode to build iOS apps with Turbo Native, yes. You will also most likely need a Mac to run Xcode. You can use a Franken Mac or whatever it's called on Windows, but I don't recommend it because it's usually a lot of extra work. So I recommend a Mac. Even the newest MacBook Air will be fine for iOS development. We create our new app here. We get thrown into what is the project, kind of like the project settings. Think under the hood, this is actually a huge XML file with a bunch of different settings ticked. Apple and Xcode really like their UI though, so they do everything visually. You're welcome to edit it under the hood, just that XML file, but sometimes it's easier to click a box than figure out what that actual key is. Off to the left is called the File Explorer. The Project Navigator. If I hover over this little thing right here, it says show the Project Navigator, and here are all the files that we get an app to start with. Right away, if I run this app by clicking on the play button up here or Command R, the nice thing about Xcode is that the simulator is already already installed, and it will just kind of launch it. Here we have an iPhone 15 Pro running iOS 17.4. Just toss that off to the right and give us a little bit more room to work with here. There we are. So yeah, it doesn't do anything. It's an empty app. We clicked empty, so we get nothing, right? The first thing we're going to want to do here is add Turbo Native to our app. And we're going to do that with File, Add Package Dependencies. Adding the package dependencies is like adding bundle add, essentially. It's what will give us our managed code, our Swift package manager, that kind of stuff. I'm going to click Turbo iOS. I've already used it. If you don't have this pop up, which you probably won't, is that you can type in http github.com hotwired turbo iOS, and it will fetch that from GitHub and download the README for you. The one change that we're going to make to this, though, is that I'm not going to use major version. I'm actually going to point to a specific branch, and we're going to point to the Turbo Navigator branch. Sorry. I'm pointing to the Turbo Navigator branch because this is essentially what Turbo iOS will be in the near future. It's where all of the new code is being added, anything that's not backwards compatible. It's kind of like a big, long-standing feature branch before a new version. What we'll want with this, though, is that it creates just way fewer steps to get started on iOS. So once you have that, click Add Package, and then click Add Package again. And you'll see over here we now have Turbo with Turbo Navigator. There's the README, and we can click this little arrow, this little chevron to actually start digging into the source code, which is pretty nice because we can just read it all. We can't actually type anything. I'm hearing a little annoying beep in my headphones right now, but we have access to it. So to actually show something on the screen, we're going to want to open the scene delegate. The scene delegate is the essential launch point of the app. This is what gets called when our scene connects. And you can think of each window on an iOS app as a scene. And we're all going to focus on iOS on the iPhone right now, so we'll only ever have one scene at a time. So we're going to use this function to kick off our app. So Xcode gives us a lot of boilerplate, like this extra lines, these comments, and then also all of these functions that I'm just going to get rid of. We don't need any of them. They're more boilerplate for like how you would handle different window transitions and stuff. We only care about this function, which is scene will connect to options, is how you would read that in Swift. Two questions here. How different PWAs from native or turbo? Progressive web apps are very different in that they don't get installed really from the App Store. They just get installed from someone clicking like add to home screen. PWAs right now are going through a little bit of a weird thing with Apple, where in the EU, Apple was like, hey, you can't install them, and then they could. So you can do a lot with progressive web apps, but not everything. Push notifications you can now do, but like local storage is a little bit tricky. Access to different sensors is becoming better, but it's still lagging behind native apps. Is it possible to access the Stripe purchase page if hosted on Stripe? Technically, yeah, you can access anything, but you would have to follow the app review guidelines to see if you can actually sell your product through Stripe. If it's software, if it's a digital good, you will almost certainly have to go through in-app purchases and not use Stripe. So here now we're back in Scene Delegate. I'm going to import Turbo, which is kind of like, we know it's working. Command B to build. Our build has succeeded, which means we've actually accessed, the Turbo framework. Remember, Swift is compiled, which means that we will get errors if we have syntax errors. Like let's say UIA window doesn't exist. When we try to build with Command B, we're going to get that doesn't exist, right? So it's kind of nice because it will kind of keep our guardrails up, but it also will kind of slow us down if you're used to Ruby, because you're going to get most of your errors at build time, not runtime. Okay, so the first thing up here after we import Turbo is we're going to create a base URL variable, which is going to equal our local host. This base URL exists outside of the Scene Delegate class, so we have access to it across our entire code base. Just a little I know it's like a global variable. It's not really used. It's sometimes frowned upon. I like it for these demos because we can access it if we ever want to create something outside of this class. In our Scene Delegate, we're going to create one additional, this time it can be private, variable called Navigator. And this is going to be our Turbo Navigator. A private let makes this a constant, and private makes it inside of Scene Delegate. So we now have access to Navigator. Turbo Navigator is all the magic of our entry point into Turbo. This is the one that we say, hey, visit this URL, and it pushes screens, it pops screens, it does all the fun stuff that we don't want to do on our own, and handles it for us really smoothly. So we have two more steps to get this started. The first step is that we have this window here, right? The window, like I said before, is connected to the session or the scene. Each scene has a window. It's what you actually see on the screen, the visual, the UI part of it, not the stuff that's managing it. So we can grab this window and set the root view controller. View controllers in iOS think of them kind of like combining the view and the controller in Rails. They have controller logic, but they also render stuff on the screen. They usually correlate to one with one different screen you're seeing at a time on iOS. And here we're saying window.rootViewController, and we're going to want to set that to the Navigator's root view controller. This now tells our scene, when you load, we want to render whatever Navigator wants us to. We're essentially handing off all of our responsibilities to this Navigator, right? So if we run the app here, what we're going to see is that we get absolutely nothing again. We still don't have anything on the screen, but we have something slightly different. Instead of that white background, we have a black background with a gray bar at the top. The root view controller, if I command click into here on Turbo Navigator, is a UI navigation controller. It manages a stack of screens for us. If you're familiar with iOS, you're probably familiar with the Contacts app. This is a navigation controller. You can see here that we have that bar up at the top and then the content. And as I drill down into screens, we get that animation that slides us when we dive deeper, and then when we kind of pop the stack back out. So this is a perfect kind of example of what to use for Turbo apps, because if you think about it, we're always navigating forward, we're always navigating back, just like the web. We'll talk about modals. Oops, no, that doesn't work. Can we do a modal here? A modal sliding up from the bottom in a second. But for now, this stack of forward and backwards is perfect. So we have that, right? Remember, our app looks like this. We have a navigation, but we don't have anything actually rendering on the screen. We need to tell Turbo Navigator what to load. And to do that, we can say Navigator dot route our base URL. I'm just going to throw a trailing slash there, so if we ever redirect to it, Rails can handle that a little bit better. Now that we've routed to our base URL, Turbo Navigator is going to essentially take over. It's going to give us everything that we need to build out this whole app. So we launch, we get our home screen. Remember that we're not signed in, right? If I open localhost here and I open up Control Command R for responsive mode, we get a screen that looks very similar to this one. Some of the elements are hidden, which I'll talk about in a second. But here I can click Get Started. I can now sign in. And if I use our user@example.com, which just comes with the seeds and password, we have our Turbo Native app. It works just like our web screen. We can add medication. We can go back. We can add our food. We can add different entries. All of this stuff with a very, very simple implementation on our iOS code base here. This is where the magic of Turbo Navigator comes into play. We barely needed any code, and we have an app that works really well. I mean, it's not perfect. There are definitely some rough edges. Like, I want to present this thing in a modal for sure, but we get a lot of stuff for free. Like, we have this flash message. We can add a water entry here. I'm going to add, let's say, I drank another 12 ounces of water and hit save. That worked right here. We get our 24 ounces. If I go back to the browser and I refresh this page, you'll see I have 12 ounces here. If I refresh this, I have 24 ounces. Like, it's connected to the database. It's rendering everything that we want with just a few lines of code. It's also setting, if you notice up here, we have Wednesday, March 13th as the title. It's automatically setting the title to our screen. So when we go to add exercise, we get new exercise entry. We navigate back, we have the title of the screen, we have Wednesday, March 13th. So we get so much for free with just 17, 18 lines of code and a package. This is why I recommend using Turbo Navigator. Again, this is going to be upstreamed into the Turbo iOS codebase in the near future. There's a question that's related to that from Marco that asks, should I wait until Turbo Navigator is the main branch if I want to work with it? Is it safe enough to use? I personally think it is safe enough to use. I'm using it for this app, which is in production. I'm using it for 3 of my clients right now. One of them is on Jumpstart Pro and doesn't use Turbo Navigator. So I think that it is safe for production. It is considered a main branch. Like, everything has to be, all PRs have to be reviewed by someone else to be merged in. As one of the maintainers of Turbo iOS, I'm doing some of those reviews, but I'm also submitting some of the code. I don't have an explicit timeline on when it will be merged, but I do know that it is where I'm starting every single one of my Turbo native projects. So I recommend you do the same. Okay, so 20 minutes in, even outside of introductions and such, we already have what looks like a fairly decent iOS app working for us. There's a lot that we could improve. Obviously, if you open the Daily Log app on your phone, you're going to get buttons in the top right or the top left that can switch between different days of the week. Also, if we go back, we kind of have this weird experience of it signs us in and out a few times, and then there's this weird settings button on the bottom. So there's obviously improvements that we could make. But for a start, this is a really good place to get us off the ground. So we're going to leave that, and we're going to pop over to Android. And for Android, we are going to do the same thing, but we're going to follow the docs. I didn't follow the docs for iOS. Well, A, because I've done it probably what you just saw 85 times. So I know it from heart, but also because it only required, these few lines of code. Android, there's a little bit more boilerplate, so to speak, to get working. So I'm going to follow the docs, which means that you can follow the docs and follow along as well. So to do that, I have pulled up over here the Turbo iOS, hotwired/Turbo iOS on GitHub, and here's Android, hotwired/Turbo Android. And then in the docs directory, we have a couple of options to start. We have quick start, we have installation, path configuration, all this exciting stuff. We're going to start with installation. So already we're talking about Gradle. Let's just see if the quick start mentions new project. A nav host fragment. So things get complicated pretty quickly, but we're going to step through each one of these together, so don't worry about it. Let's get started. Open Android Studio. I'm going to create a new project, and we're going to create a I think we'll want to create, let's see, does the Android docs recommend, this talks about internet permissions. I just want to make sure we don't want to create a existing activity or a turbo activity. So this is using a main activity. So we're going to create an empty activity one, and then we're going to change it to work with our turbo activity. Activities are weird in Android. Forgive me if this isn't 100% accurate. I'm a little less experienced in Android than iOS, but remember how I said on iOS there were scenes and then there were view controllers? On Android, a kind of equivalent is activities versus fragments. Fragments are closer to view controllers. You have kind of like one fragment per screen. Activities used to be how Android apps manage different screens. Each screen would be their own activity. Very memory intensive though. And now it's usually recommended that you use a single activity for your entire app. So outside of essentially one main activity, main capital M, you won't have more than any activities than just that. It's also recommended in the docs that you use a single activity. So we're going to create an empty activity here. We're going to call it daily log. And we're going to toss it on the desktop as well. And don't forget to do, we'll call it Android. This is a big decision with Android apps, is which version you want to support. With iOS, it's always the recommendation is to support 2 versions back. So if iOS 17 just came out, you want to at least support 16, maybe 15. On Android, there are many kind of incremental builds. What I usually do is get me something over 90%, if not 95% of devices. So here we can say Nougat would be 95, 93.5, 93.7. Good enough for me. This is a demo app. Obviously, if your users have older devices, you want to go back older versions, but Oreo sounds good to me. Cool. So, I think I already messed up. So what happened here is, like I said, on iOS, we have Swift UI and UIKit. On Android, we have traditional XML-based views, and then we have Jetpack Compose. And this created a Jetpack Compose app for us, which means that we have something that looks really nice. Daily log theme, surface, a greeting. Unfortunately, doesn't work really well with how Turbo Android works, so we're going to do that again. I'm going to open up our desktop here and just delete that. So let's try again. And this time we're going to start from absolutely nothing, no activity. I'm going to call it daily log again, and I'll get to questions in 1 sec. And hit finish. So while this does its stuff, we have some questions here. Adam asks, if I understand correctly, if I submit an application and change my website, the one that embed into a native application, that will be instant live, no need to resubmit the app to Apple. That is correct. We can demo that pretty quickly here. If I rerun the iOS app, we have our exercise medication, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to just open up our, this is, I believe, the day show page and say, type in hi Adam right there, and then when I refresh this, we have our text there. So that could be someone launching the app again, someone refreshing a page. Obviously, that didn't require any changes to the iOS app at all or any of the iOS code base. As long as it exists on your server, it'll exist in your app. This is a web view. Right here is just rendering web content, HTML, CSS, turbo frames, turbo streams. It's all just web stuff. So whatever your website does, your iOS app and your Android app will as well. Okay, so Android Studio finished loading. I'm going to open up Kotlin and Java, daily log, and we get absolutely nothing, which, okay, that sounds good. So let's follow the tutorial. First, we want to add a dependency from Maven Central to our apps module. So let's do this. Let's split it across so we can see. We're going to open our Gradle scripts and open our module, which is this one, not top level. We'll hide that. And we're going to want to add a dependency. So down here, we have all of our dependencies. We're going to want to add a implementation, and it's called dev.hotwire turbo, and then latest version I'm going to get from right here, 7.1.0. Okay, oh, it was right there. And this is telling us that, let's sync now. I thought these had to be in strings. I don't know why the other ones aren't, or in quotes. So let's try again. So what's going on here is this is our Gradle file. It's kind of like a build config. It also lays out our dependencies. It does a lot on Android. I don't actually understand everything that's going on here, but what we care about right now is that we have these dependencies and we have implementation. This is like how we did before. We did file, add, package dependencies, right? We're adding our dependency into our Gradle file, and then when I sync it, it will actually gather all the resources and compile it and do all the fun stuff to give us something we can work with. We have a warning here. Use catalog version instead. No, that's wrong. Okay, good enough. Require min SDK. So we require SDK 26, which we should be good. Yep. Okay, so Oreo is the minimum. So there's a good way to start. Oreo, which is 26, is the minimum there. And we'll want to target 34, which this looks good. We'll need to make sure that we allow the app to access the internet. So in our Command-Shift-O for kind of quickly open, we want to access our Android manifest file. And up here, outside of the application, we want to copy paste that to say, hey, we also access the internet. Otherwise, the Android app wouldn't be able to access the internet, which would make this completely useless for us. This shows up when someone downloads the app in Google Play, what permissions the app has. And we aren't going to use a pre-release build, so we can skip that part. Okay, we're installed. So, I don't think we can actually run this. I don't think it'll even work because we don't have an activity. Let's see. One of the things that's a little bit annoying about Android Studio is that it's a little bit slower to go from 0 to 1, but also a little bit slower. Yeah, we don't have an activity to just kind of like do everything, I find. That is what it is. It's not Turbo and Android's fault. It's, what's it called? Android's fault. So I'm going to skip step 1 and go right to activity. And we're going to create a Turbo activity layout resource. And I'm going to skip just to here to give us an activity. So we're going to create a new Kotlin class or file. We're going to want to create a main activity. And this is going to inherit from app compat activity and also Turbo activity. And this always needs to override on create. And that's actually the wrong one. I'm just copying and pasting from the left here. So override late init var delegate, Turbo activity delegate. And then on create saved instance bundle, call super, set our content view. This is going to yell at us. We don't have this yet. And I obviously understand there's a lot going on here, so we're going to take a step back in a second. But okay, so just wanted to create our activity to make sure that we could actually launch the app. Now that we have an activity, I think we should be able to launch. So we need a way to tell Android that where our activity is, right? And we need a way essentially to tell this that it should run. Okay. Activity is not declared in Android manifest. So let's open up that. And theme. Okay, well, I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to create a new Android project. We're going to go back to that single activity one, or empty activity. We're just going to call it my application. And we're going to open up, we couldn't use this one because it used Jetpack Compose, which we didn't really want to work with just yet, but I am going to cheat here and look at our Android manifest file. And there we are. We have an activity. I'm going to copy that over to inside of application. And we have, don't want a theme. Okay, so let's see if that works. We're just trying to get something to run on the emulator here. I don't care if it actually works just yet. I just want something to, oh, perfect. Okay, so we're in. That's a lot how I do Android development. See what the defaults are given to us, see what the example app gives us. But that gives us a good starting point. So now we can go back and actually follow the tutorial. So Shift Escape to close out the bottom. Create a nav host fragment. A nav host fragment is very similar to our navigation controller on iOS. So we're going to want to do the same thing here where we're going to want to have one that manages our stack of screens, our stack of fragments, right? So to do that, we get a bunch of copy paste code. I'm going to type it all out because I want to talk about what each thing does, at least as best as I can describe it. So create a new class called main session nav host fragment. Remember that this is the wrapper, this is the stack of screen manager, the navigation controller, so to speak. So this inherits from turbo session nav host fragment, and let's just make sure there's not an open parenthesis. Yep, there is. Grab the default initializer there. And this has a couple of things that we need to set on it. First is this session name. Override val session name equals main. This identifies each session in your app. So if you have like tabs and you want to have different sessions, they'll want to have different names. We have the start location, which we're going to say before is localhost 3000. It's a string, I believe, so that should be fine. Now well, besides the extra slash there, tricky part about this is that Android can't access localhost like iOS can. So we actually need to give it, doesn't say in the docs, but we need to give it 10.0.1. And I can show you that by opening the browser here, Chrome, and trying to visit localhost 3000. We'll even give it the benefit of the doubt. We'll give it an HTTP. And you'll see we can't reach it, but if we access HTTP 10.0.1 port 3000, well, it's supposed to work. Let's see. Maybe I got that wrong. So let's search the repository. Oh, 10.0.2.2. Where I got. So let's do that. I don't know where I got 1.1. 10.0.2.2 accesses our local host on our kind of host machine, which is our, our Mac that I'm running here. So thank you, documentation there. We have where we're going to start. So that's the page that we load, the home page, right? Registered activities. This is not going to do anything. We don't have any activities outside of our main one. If we had some like crazy barcode scanner that was like a third party thing that ran in its own activity, we'd want to register it here. For now, we can just do get equals a list of empty. It's empty. But here, registered fragments is where we actually need to say which screens are you registering here. And for screens, we want to do a web fragment class. That doesn't exist yet, right? That doesn't exist. The web fragment doesn't exist. So one of the nice things about Android Studio is that we highlight, it's red here, Option Enter. We can create that class, web fragment, right here. Extract to a separate file. I'm just clicking Enter. Cool, looks good. Boom, web fragment, right? Down below, we have our web fragment. And all we need to do is say that this inherits from a turbo web fragment. And then it needs this turbo nav graph destination URI. Talk about that in a sec. But for now, turbo fragment web. Okay? And we get rid of that. Maybe join those. Cool. Looks good. I don't think we need those. Even better, even cleaner. So back in our main session nav host fragment, we now are saying these are the registered fragments. This is where we would say, okay, Turbo Native can also navigate to a sign-in screen, and it's native. So we'd register a sign-in fragment or an authentication fragment or what have you here. The last thing that this needs, and then I'm going to hop over to questions, is that we need a path configuration. We need to talk about path configuration because it needs to work, or we need to have it set up for Turbo Android to work. We don't need it for Turbo iOS. Turbo iOS can get by without it, but Turbo Android will need one. So we'll get into that in just a second here. So let's dive into questions really quick so we don't get too far ahead. Adam, hopefully that was enough of an answer, Adam, to figure out that you don't need to release a new version just to change web stuff. Is Turbo Android compatible with native bottom navigation bar and how navigation should be handled between tabs? Yeah, you can do tabs. If you look at Basecamp or similar on Android, they have tabs running across the bottom. You can still use a single activity, and you use different Turbo session nav host fragments for each tab, making sure that you set a different session name for each of them, tab 1, tab 2, tab 3, or whatever you're going to name them. Jumpstart Pro does this dynamically a little bit differently. It doesn't use separate nav stacks. It just uses them as like kind of buttons. I like this approach a little bit better because it gives us the separate screens and hierarchy, those different navigation stacks, if you use a new one of these for each tab. Adam asks, not sure what web APIs are available in the web view, local storage, IndexedDB. I don't have experience with either of those, but it's a web view. So if WK WebView supports it and Chrome Web Client supports it, it should work in your Turbo native apps. Okay, cool. So that's all we have for questions right now. Okay, back to Android. If we run this, we didn't actually finish setting everything up. So we're gonna leave this blank. I'm gonna leave it blank because I'm gonna show you how this breaks if things aren't set up correctly. So we're gonna leave this blank here. We're gonna kind of set a to-do in our mind, and we're gonna go to the next step, which is create an activity. We already created our activity. We have our main activity, but we first need an activity to give it a layout resource. A layout resource is the view hierarchy. They use Android X. They use XML to create these views, and they've gotten a lot better. Like you can actually visualize them, but they're still XML, so a little bit finicky. So I'm going to copy this thing I'm going to open up our res layout. We need a new directory here called layouts. So we're going to do a new Android resource directory called layout. Call it layout. Beautiful. And inside that, we're going to want to create a new layout resource file. We're going to call it activity main to match the activity that it's going to correspond to. Hit OK. And now we have what is, I mean, I'll be honest, just super complicated looking. I don't like this view. This is showing us the design view. There's actually, the screen is right here. It's actually just really, really, really tiny. It's showing us the kind of like day versus night, the light versus dark mode of the view. I look at the code. That's how I like to think about it. But I think the best balance is this split view, where we get the view of what we're seeing, a preview almost, and then we also get the actual code here. So I already have in my clipboard, so I'm just going to paste that right in. We have an error here, which I'll get to in a second. What this is doing is creating a constraint layout that matches the parent's height and width. And then inside of that, we have a fragment container view. All this is saying is plop our main activity inside this view and fill the screen. That's all of this code does, right? So we give this ID to the fragment, and we also need to give it a name. Here, we want to give it com Maserati main session nav host fragment. Now we've said when this view loads, pop one of these inside of it, right? Back in our main activity, we can set our content view. So when this thing loads, what view do you want to use? This is the content we want to display. r.layout.activity main, I'm going to command click on this, is where we matched up right here. So we have r.layout.activity main, that lines us up to right here. Activity main, sorry, is the name of the file, and it knows it can find it in there. This is the name of the class that was lined up. This is actually, statically typed, so to speak, so we get a red error if we misspell that. Finally, in our main activity, we need to do a couple things here. Late init delegate, turbo activity delegate. This is setting a property, a member called delegate. It's a var, so it means it can be changed. It's not val, which is a constant. Late init means that it's lazily initialized. It's not going to be created until after the activity is created. And that means that it knows it might access it before, but we're going to run into an error. So on create is the one who's actually creating it. It's a nice way if we had this here, we get an error, right? Because how does it know what to create when main activity is created? There's nothing that says what this is supposed to be. So we'd have to make it some sort of like optional. You don't want to do that. You don't want to have to deal with optionals throughout the entire code, the entire file. So we can say late init here, let the compiler know this will be added later, trust us. And that's where we're doing it right here. That's where we're initializing it. Okay, so we have our web fragments, and we are going to skip that, remember? So now I'm going to run the app. I'm going to see what happens. So we launch the app, and then we pop right back to our home screen. So what's going on? Let's try that again. Daily log keeps stopping. Cool, super helpful. Thank you. It's crashing, right? App info doesn't give us any information. We don't have any information down here in the logs. How do we know what's going on, right? Android spits all of its logging out to something called logcat. Logcat spits out a ton of information, but you can see here that we have some red stuff, which is errors. So what I'm going to do is filter this to be package mine and then level error. We now only have the errors in our app. If I got rid of this, there is just, so much logging. Which makes sense. We're running a debug build. We have the whole Android operating system running underneath us. Some are warnings, some are not. Some are actionable, some are not. It's too much. So I'm just going to use package mine, which means only care about the daily log whatever daily log is spitting out, and only care about an error level for now. So what is going on? Kotlin, not implemented error. An operation is not implemented, not yet implemented. And it's saying that on this line, we haven't implemented a method or a function. And that's absolutely correct. We have a to-do there. So Android is telling us, hey, stupid, you left a to-do in your app, and we called that, and now we're going to blow up. So this is another way of raising an exception for when you're not ready to build something. We need it, though. We need to have this path configuration. So if we, for now, let's just try, give it turbo path configuration.location. I'm following the tutorial off on the left. But instead of giving it these two, what if we give it nothing? So we say, hey, here's where you go get your path configurations from nowhere. I can't even tell if that already opened and crashed or not. Yeah, it crashed on us. And why? Let's clear our logs with the trash sign and see what we got for our new error. Should I have a mouse that scrolled to the right? Oh, I can use this actually. Error inflating class, fragment, container view. It can't parse a URI. So it can't parse a URI coming from the path configuration. It's trying to match this to a screen by finding URIs that have this, which doesn't actually exist. So we do need a path configuration. So we're going to give it a remote path configuration, a remote file URL, and we're going to say start location, and we're going to append, where do I have it? Localhost. Oh, we don't have one actually. We need to create one. Let's look at our routes. We have configurations route, and then we get iOS on collections. So that's configurations /.json. So what is a path configuration, right? Why am I even going into this song and dance? A path configuration is a way for us to remotely configure our app from our server. This JSON file gets loaded when the app launches, and we can change the behavior of how different things work. So here, we're saying that whenever we visit a page that ends in new, edit, or is settings, we want to present it as a modal. That's something that Turbo understands and knows how to present. If I were to pop back over to the iOS app and give this thing a path configuration, and then I say private let and we're going to want to give it a server, and we're going to take our base URL, pending path, configurations, right? Now, the app is going to request that path configuration on launch, configure our app for it, and now anytime we present a screen that ends in new, what was it? /new, /edit, or settings, we're going to present it as a modal. So that we can configure from the server, right? So right now we have the settings screen presenting as a modal. If we didn't want the settings screen presenting as a modal, we comment that line out, we rerun the app so it fetches the new version of our path configuration. That could also be just if someone stopped and reran it. And now settings is no longer a modal, right? Because we commented that line out. So we can configure the behavior of our app without having to relaunch our app. Android requires this, but a little bit more to know how to match different screens up, okay? So Let's create one for Android. And if you notice, I believe that the Android SDK, do they talk about? They do. This is the simplest form of a path configuration for Android. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to create a new method called Android. We're going to paste that in there. We're going to open our routes file. We're going to also get Android on collection. There's probably a way to clean that up, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. So now we can actually get, we have our iOS version, right? Let's get our Android version. Is that redirect? Oh, I'm just spitting out a string. Render JSON. And okay, Android. Now we have our settings screenshot enabled. So we have our Android kind of configuration all set up, right? Do I want to fix this? No, I don't want to fix this. Let's do bundle exec standard RB fix. Cool. So iOS, we had nothing in our settings. On Android, we want to set screenshots enabled to true. That will make sure that when we navigate back between screens, we have that beautiful screenshot that doesn't have to request from the server every single time. And then matching every single pattern, not just new editor settings, we're going to want to set this turbo fragment web URI. If you remember from earlier, that is where we lined up our web fragment to match a turbo navgrass destination URI. Android works a little bit differently in iOS in that it does all the routing for you. It says which screens match which patterns, bind it like right here, and we'll present it for you. Boom, 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 boom. iOS, you're required to do a little bit more work to get that working, so we don't have this concept of URI in iOS. Let's run the app and see what we get on Android. Well, actually, it's still going to break because we didn't actually configure it. Let's just double check that. Should be broken. Yep. And here, where we have our nav host fragment, we're saying that the turbo path config is just start location. Well, that's wrong. It's actually start location / configurations / android.json. And what I'm going to do is just monitor our server here and make sure that we're getting the right request coming in. I launched the app, it's bouncing. What do we get here in our server logs? Nothing. The app didn't even launch. What's going on, Logcat? What are you complaining about now? They might not like this. All right, well, this one might need some more debugging on my end. I don't know what's going on here. Clear text, right. Okay, so clear text communication to 10.0.22 is not permitted by network security policy. What's it saying is that it's on HTTPS, and we need to give it a special exception to allow non-HTTPS connections. Luckily for us, that is in somewhere in the, oh look, there's 10.0.22. If only I had read. So here we are, the URL of your starting location. Note if you're running your app locally without HTTPS, you'll need to adjust your Android uses clear text traffic in your manifest file. So in your manifest file, it's a setting. I think it goes here. Yep, true. Okay, so now we've configured the entire app to allow HTTP access, not just HTTPS. Normally you'd want to throw this in like a debug config, out of scope for today. Let's run the app again, and let's see what we got. And we're still crashing with, okay, well this time we actually hit the server though, and we processed it correctly. So the app launched in some way, but we're getting a different error this time. And it's always so hard to tell if it's a new or an old error, so we're going to run it one more time. Mr. Logcat. Okay. Unable to start activity, binary XML file line 13, error inflating class. So we have our layout, we have our activity main, line 13. Default nav host. Let's see if we mixed anything up there. We have our path configuration now. That's supposed to be false. We have our main activity, which sets our delegate, override late init. We have our web view fragment, and we have our path configuration. 10.022.3000. We don't need to register anything in here. We registered our web fragment. We've hit this. I'm not gonna do something dynamic just to be safe. Oops. 10.022.3000. Configurations.json. I don't think that was the problem, but we're gonna just remove one variable. Ah, it was. Okay, so something about that didn't like 2 slashes. So there we go. We have our, what was that little stretch? We have our Android app working. Obviously, a lot more stuff that needed to be written, but not a lot of code per se, really just configuration. Something that coming from iOS, I think could be simplified a little bit more. Maybe not. I'm not an Android expert. I'm only like the turbo native part of it, but it feels like a lot of this could be simplified a little bit more. There's obviously a lot of improvements that we could do, like daily log is showing up 3 times here. One of these is the action bar. One of these is from the web. We probably want to hide some of those. But for the most part, I'm pretty sure we have a working app here. Yeah, I mean, we're signed in. We can sign back out. You can use the back button. There's a screenshot that just loaded. I mean, yeah, we get our flash messages. We have a working Android app. It's ugly. You could use some improvement, but yeah, it works. I'm going to pop over to questions for a little bit, and before we move on to maybe, probably not going to have time for Strata on both platforms. What we're going to do here is we're going to move Q&A up. I'm going to answer some questions in the chat right now. If anyone else has more questions, I'm going to spend a lot of time answering them, and then we're going to talk about how we add Strata to iOS. We might not get, I don't think we're going to get to Android today, but we might not even get to either. It's already been an hour. Let's do Q&A for right now, and then we will reassess. Okay, so can I show these questions on the screen? That would be really nice. Okay, so we answered about the bottom navigation bar. We answered this. Can I copy this? Sorry, I'm just messing around with OBS here, and it's, yeah, this will work. So the question that I'm currently answering is currently about the same question that asked for iOS, and I apologize, I'm going to mispronounce your names. Radu asked, is Turbo Android compatible with native navigation bar? So how would we do bottom navigation for iOS? Very similar thing that we would for Android. Instead of having a single navigator that has a single navigation controller, we would have multiple navigators. So this would be something like, an array of navigators, right? And then we would add each one of those for each of our tabs. And then this would eventually not be the navigator.root view controller. It would be a tab bar controller. Then we would assign our tab bar controller dot view controllers to equal our navigators, right, and map over those. So we would iterate through our array of navigators, or we'd create our array of navigators there, and we'd spit out our controllers to set on the tabs, and then we would have multiple tabs across the bottom. So a separate session for each of those, a separate path config, yada, yada, yada. Okay, next question is, Adam asks about APIs. I touched on that. Jason asks, remember seeing a tweet and reading an article where you mentioned you're able to achieve saving data and rendering that data to a page if the app went offline. So I didn't use a web view for it. It was done entirely native. And for reference, I believe the article you're talking about, maybe I didn't write an article on it. No, there you are. Offline access. So I think that what you're talking about is like this section of this article here. I'll send a link in the chat. I'm not going to dive into how the code works for this because it was pretty specific to the platform, or sorry, to the client. But at a high level, what we did was we know that if we set a delegate here on Turbo Navigator, right, we can then extend our scene delegate to be the Turbo Navigator delegate error. We can get this callback, visitable did fail request, that happens every time an error occurs. If that error, dot status, we have to cast it and do all this really not fun, exciting stuff. But essentially, status code equals a specific status code. We can know that the app is offline. And if the app is offline, we can present a fully native flow. I did all of this through a Swift UI flow. That Swift UI flow could read data that's persisted locally and displayed on the screen. So the way that the whole workflow worked was every time the user launched the app, they would make a network request, a JSON request to the server and say, hey, what data does this user have to store for offline access? They would fetch that data, they would write it to disk, and then anytime they opened the app and they realized that the user was offline, we would show that screen here reading the data from disk. And to persist it to disk was pretty much writing JSON to local storage and just reading that JSON from local storage every single time. It was a little finicky, or not, it's not super robust. It has edge cases that need to be handled in terms of like if you update your server's JSON, the apps might be invalid all of a sudden. So there's versioning problems if you want to go all the way down that route. But it gave us a really quick escape hatch for a fully offline flow for a single tiny sliver of the app's functionality. It's not an approach to use if you want to rebuild the entire app, if you want all of the app's functionality for offline access. If you want to do that, Turbo Native really isn't the right answer there. You want to go with something a little bit more native, offline friendly. Hopefully that was helpful, Jason. Jason's second question of 3. Oops. Did I say something? There you go. Do you store that data in the native app? Is the data... Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, it's a JSON structure, that object that I store locally and then read through, I think, a keyed archiver or something. And then Android would be probably very similar. Okay, next question from Jason is, other than a modal, what other context can we use? Is this something we need to write ourselves? Great question. So if you go to Turbo iOS and you switch over to the Turbo Navigator branch, oh, this is actually a good reminder that I don't think There we are, Turbo Navigator. We have this crazy chart of all the things that Turbo Navigator handles for you out of the box, right? Given that we're in a default screen and we want to present a modal, what happens? We present a modal. Given that we're in a modal screen and we present another modal, we push a modal. So all of this stuff is handled for you, right? Contexts are only modal and default. Default is just if you don't say anything. Sorry, it's actually here. There are different presentations, though, which we didn't get into in this demo, which is a different key in that array. Instead of context, you can also add presentation. And presentation can be any of replace, pop, refresh, etc. Those all have different ways of navigating the user around your app. So you can replace the current screen, like if they submit a form, or pop the screen if they finished everything on the current screen and you want to go back or dismiss a modal. Clear all is drop the entire navigation stack and go back to the beginning. Replace root is take the new screen, drop the entire stack, and just show it at the beginning. None doesn't do anything. So you have a lot of different options there, but these are the only things that are actually built into Turbo Navigator in terms of like customizing the flow. All of this you get for free just based on the situation of where the app is when that new screen is presented. Hopefully that was helpful. Yeah. Marius, I believe, if that's how I'm pronouncing it correctly, is pretty much saying that right here, it's baked into Turbo Native. There's advanced, default behavior, but also replace. And I told you more. Yeah, it's not baked into Turbo Native as much as it's baked into the Turbo Navigator layer on top of Turbo Native. So you'll want to use that Turbo Native Navigator branch to get that functionality. Graham asks, how do you pass data from a Turbo Web view to a native Swift UI view? There are two ways that you can do that. One would be to use a Strata component that pulled some data from the web view and then like persisted it somewhere, and then when you presented the Swift UI screen, pass that data along. But I would recommend not passing data between the web view and native Swift UI view. What I would recommend is that when you render a Swift UI screen, create a JSON endpoint and fetch the data via an API. You run into a lot of like song and dance around passing data around and like failed JavaScript messages and all this stuff when you'd rather just, if you're going to use Swift UI for a screen, build the thing with Swift UI, do a native network request, go through the scaffolding of building up all of that because it'll be worth it, in my opinion, in the long run. Marius asks, do I roll out apps with Devise login only? No, I don't use Devise really at all anymore. I use it for Rails devs, but this app for the daily log, I have a authentication concern, which is this entire file, which is all of authentication, no gems or anything like that. And this is open source, so you can grab it on the, if you go to dailylog.ing, daily logging, and then click the GitHub button in the top right, you can use this if you want to. It doesn't do password reset, doesn't do forgot password and stuff, but it gets me just enough that someone can sign in and register for a new account and stay signed in on the iOS and Android upcoming Android client. If someone wants to reset their password, they can email me for now. Obviously, that's not scalable, but I find this way easier to work with for getting a Turbo Native app off the ground because you don't have to deal with just fighting Devise the whole time, which is what I find ends up happening when I use Devise. Okay, we have another question here from Oase. Pronouncing that wrong, I apologize. Do you have any thoughts on doing offline mode for more complex use cases where making a fully native use is untenable? I think if you need more complex offline access, you should reassess Turbo Native, sadly. It's not its best use case, and you're going to end up doing a lot of fighting the framework to get it to work the way you want. There are, if I go to the Turbo iOS and I search for offline, there's an issue here that I'll drop in the chat that I asked. Jay provided a lot of context on how much work they went through to get it working for Hey. Android actually works a little bit better. You can actually cache WebView stuff for Android. But for iOS, they actually had to set up an entire server running inside the iOS app just to reroute different requests for assets to make sure that offline caching worked. There's some back and forth here around, is this where it talks about it? No. There's the solid cache that's coming to Turbo 8 on the web that was supposed to help out with the Turbo native apps. But from my understanding, that is not a priority right now for the native apps. There's some other stuff that we're working on, and that native support would have to be built out on your own. And to do a fully native with like, saving, create, or edit actions and then uploading them to the server, you're gonna want to just, in my opinion, do it natively. If you want to use Turbo Native and you absolutely need offline access, see what the minimum slice of functionality you can make offline, build that natively, and have the rest be on the web. That's kind of like where the best approach is. That's what I did for that client in the article that I just showed you. They needed offline access to the tickets they bought, essentially, to tours. So we built that one screen, those 3 screens natively, and the rest is on the web. So they have access to 3 screens offline and 150 screens on the web, and it's a good balance for them. Another question from same person here. Oh no, this is from Marius. How would you implement the tab UI that changes after login? That's a tricky one because the way that I like to look at these is like, you don't want to have your tabs changing if the user signed in or signed out. You want to just cover the tabs with a screen that the user can't get past if they're not signed in. So one way to do that is that you can present in the iOS configurations controller. This might not be documented, so I might need to go back and do this, but you can say modal style full screen. Let me double check that. Actually, I can do it right here. If I open up, if I search in package dependencies, and I look for, so modal presentation style, modal style. So here, when we set the properties of like context modal, we can give it a few different options. We can give it medium, large, or full. Medium is the default one. But if we give this full, watch what happens when we load a modal here. It covers the entire screen, right? So like let's roll that back for a sec. Let's go back to default and run this. When I click plus sign to get a modal, it doesn't go all the way up, and I can click and pull this down to dismiss the screen, right? If I make it full screen, I can't get rid of it. I'm blocking the user right now. So if this was the authentication screen, you could always show the tabs and then show a login screen if they're not signed in that blocks the rest of the app for you. Yeah, you would get that quick flash of like seeing the tabs for a split second and then the screen sliding up. You could work around that with some custom animations, but this works really well because you don't ever have to worry about like, are they logged in or not? You just say the sign-in screen is a full screen modal, and when they sign in, it goes away and they loads the tabs for you. It's a much easier approach. It gets you like, in my opinion, 95% of the way there versus a ton of extra code. The 5% being that weird flicker at the beginning when you launch the app for the first time. But you save like, I don't know, a couple hundred lines of code of native stuff, of managing things. what I usually do if a client can deal with it. If not, we go the long route and build out the full native thing, and the price goes up, right? It's all trade off. Okay, another question about tab bars. Sounds like I might need to do a whole session on tab bars. Andre asks, if you use mix of screens which use sign-in, they do not share a session and you need to relog in. Can you please show how tab bar and multiple navigators can share a session? So under the hood, the navigators are all using different sessions. That is correct. I'm in the Turbo Navigator class, they each have their own session and their own modal session. But if you use the default initializer, the one that just passes in an optional path configuration, an optional delegate, the one we talked about this whole time, right? If you aren't passing in your own session, those sessions are using the same shared process pool. And a shared process pool shares cookies and shares caching, which means that across all of your web views, if you sign in on one web view, all those cookies will be shared across the different ones. So if you sign in on one tab, the second tab will know about it. It won't reload the page. Doesn't have anything built in to do that. But if you do reload the page, you will be signed in. So you don't have to worry about that anymore with Turbo Navigator. This is a common approach that was in every one of my apps for my clients, just share a process pool across everything. So we just rolled it into Turbo Navigator. Like, why should you have to worry about that on your own? You get it for free now. Okay, some encouraging comments about full screen stuff. This would be good to display on App Startup. Yeah, you can display it on Startup. Yeah, all that works really well. Okay. I apologize that we didn't get to Strata. If you came here for Strata and I didn't cover it, then let me know and we can do a separate session that's just on Strata. I think that would be really valuable. The Android stuff took a little bit longer than I wanted to, but hopefully I answered a bunch of your questions around everything. I'm going to drop one more link to my newsletter in the chat here. If you are thinking about doing more Turbo Native stuff, if you're interested, you're excited, I definitely recommend checking that out. It's every week. Obviously, some weeks are different. And this week was more about promoting the live stream here. So I'm going to wrap up in just like 5 minutes here. This is the last call for questions from everyone. If you have a question on Strata, not Strata, if you have a question on the way that apps work or Turbo Native, all that good stuff. Thanks for the encouragement on Buy a Coffee page, Jason. I will think about setting one of those up. For now, you can thank me by subscribing to my newsletter. That always helps. If you are looking for something that's a little bit more like in-depth on Turbo Native, definitely take a look at Maserati.com/book. I don't think my server is down. Who knows what's going on here. I swear that this happens to me more often than I care to admit, where it doesn't work in Safari. So Maserati.com/book will redirect you here to give you a little bit more details on what the book is going to cover. You'll notice that we're talking about Strata, we're talking about tabs. Oh, I need to update this. Sneak peek for those that are in the live stream. The book will cover tabs. I've already written the chapter for iOS, and this is actually not super up to date. So let me get back in there and rework this. But tabs will be covered for sure. Tabs will definitely be covered. So I'm going to wrap up with this one last question from Emmanuel here, who asks, copy and paste it into here. What is the best way to configure the JavaScript bridge? The best way to configure the JavaScript bridge is to not configure it. You don't need it anymore. Use Strata. The JavaScript bridge was a, for lack of a better word, a bridge until Strata is ready. And if you're working with Strata or Turbo Native in a modern sense, like a new project, use Strata. It will get you everything the JavaScript bridge would get you, but with way less code and way less configuration after the initial setup. Ahmed asks how easy it is for a Rails developer to work with Turbo Native. I think that it has a high barrier to entry. You have to know a little bit of Swift, you have to know a little bit of iOS, you have to know a lot of Rails. But I think that when you finish that initial MVP of both of your apps, you're going to be hooked, and it will be worth the effort you put in. The book that I'm doing is going to assume that I'm writing is going to assume you have zero Kotlin and zero iOS experience, and is going to dive into every single line of code as if you were a Rails developer. So if that's you, the book is written for you. It's Turbo Native for Rails developers, and it's all going to be structured around that. Difficulties for a Rails dev building Turbo app. It's Swift, it's Kotlin. There's going to be difficulties of learning a brand new language. I've been very surprised with how helpful ChatGPT has been in helping me learn Android again, and for me to refresh my Android skills, especially I used to do Android on Java, now it's all written in Kotlin, so that was all new to me. ChatGPT has been pretty helpful there, but if you ask ChatGPT how to build you a Turbo Native app, I still haven't seen it spit something out that works, so my job is still safe, at least for a little while. That is going to wrap it up for today. Thank you, everyone who showed up. I'm going to hopefully not break this stream right here. And let's see, can I do it? Can I do it really fast? I just want to see how many people are watching right now. Can I figure that out? It says I'm live. We got almost 30 people. That's really exciting. Thank you, everyone who joined. If you want to throw me a tip for coffee, I don't have anything like that set up. Subscribe to the newsletter is where I'm going to be writing all of this stuff. You'll have first access to new book chapters. You'll have first access to when I release new content. It sounds like people want to learn requests for content. People want to know more about tabs. People want a live stream on Strata. If there's anything else that you want to see right here, drop that in the chat. I'll add it to the list for some future stuff. But until then, again, I am Joe Mazzalotti. I am a Turbo Native expert, and I build iOS and Android apps that are powered by your Rails code. If you need a hand specifically, if you want to do some maybe pair programming or what have you, check out services. Down at the bottom, you can book a pairing session with me where we just kind of code for 90 minutes. It's paid. It helps support my other work. And I've had a couple people, one client or one customer, we did all of their tabs in just one session. And another, we built their app from scratch and got image uploading working. So really effective 90 minutes. And then, of course, if your company or business needs help with their apps, send me an email on this page, from this page as well. I'm more than happy to help, and I have some upcoming bandwidth in the next few months. That's all, everyone. Thank you again for stopping by, and I hope to see you both on the newsletter or on Twitter and the next time I do a live stream. Bye, everyone. Talk to you next time.